Today on Chasing Leviathan, we pursue the big question, how should we think about our food? My guest is Dr. Sarah Worth, professor of philosophy at Furman University. We discuss why the history of philosophy has been biased against our sense of taste, and I learn what the slow food movement is. So please, come have a seat with us and learn to listen with me. Tell us a little bit about you, Dr. Worth. Yeah, we're talking about your book, Taste, A Philosophy of Food, which is just, I think everyone can relate to this topic. It's a real, everyone's excited
Everyone
about food,
eats.
I think. Yes. So tell us what inspired you to, on your journey of philosophy, and then specifically your journey of philosophy for food. Tell us about Dr. Worth.
Yeah. Well, I am a professor of philosophy, and my specialty was and is philosophy of art and aesthetics, and specifically about reading and literature and narrative. And how reading fiction impacts our emotions. So that's actually what my first book was about, and it's sort of where my focus has been for a long time. But honestly, I gave birth to twins in 2006, and
Congratulations.
yeah, thanks. I was actually my husband was in Baghdad when that happened, and so. They were actually 7 months old by the time he came back. And so I had a really big question facing me, which was, what am I going to feed them?
Yeah.
And so it seemed really odd to me to buy a jar of bananas at the grocery store when I had bananas on my counter. And the whole thing just seemed really weird all of a sudden, the baby food industry. And so, like a philosopher, but not a normal person, I started reading, and I started reading books about philosophy and food rather than, like new mom books. And so I started reading about the philosophy of food, and it's a relatively new topic in philosophy, really just maybe 20, maybe 30 years old. And at the same time, it seemed to me the most obvious philosophical topic ever, because it really is the physical manifestation of the way that we interact with the world, right? We take what is outside of us and put it inside of us. And that's a big philosophical question. That just sort of starts us out with the question of, am I what I eat? Or in what ways is what I eat who I am? Or how does what I eat affect my my wakefulness, or my consciousness, or my levels of depression, or my my energy level, or my gut bacteria, or I don't know. In the beginning of the book, I say, I give this anecdote about my mom, who said, if you keep eating Cheerios at the rate that you've been eating them, you're going to turn into a Cheerio. And I panicked.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I had a dream where I had a giant hole in my belly, and it was so powerful of an image that I just stopped eating Cheerios. And I think that was a philosophical moment for me that began when I was 6. So I didn't think seriously about it, but when I started having to feed my kids, and I wanted to make my own baby food and buy things organic at the farmer's market, and then cook all the sweet potatoes myself. And my boys are actually just made of sweet potatoes. But so that I really started thinking, and then I was able to teach a class on the philosophy of food, because I teach at a great university, and my chair at the time said, if you're excited about it, they'll be excited about it. How bad could it be? And then,
sorry, that's good.
Yeah, I
So
mean, no, I mean he was great, and then he really did give us a lot of leeway to teach what we were interested in, and because I teach at a great university that has a lot of support, I thought, I don't want to
mm,
just talk about food. I want to have a lab. I want to cook every week with all of my students. And so, long, complicated story short, I was able to set up a thing with the food service company, and we cooked every week with the head chef from the university. Something that was in line with whatever we were talking about in the class. And
that's
so
awesome.
almost overnight, I became the most popular teacher on campus.
Of course, yes. Especially
Yeah,
for college kids, like, oh man, I get at least one good meal. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it was fun and it was exciting, and it's all of a sudden there's sort of a serious moment where you can think about food. And then as the years went on, I just thought this really is the most important thing for philosophers to think about. How is it that we
Mm,
don't think about this? Because food is, of course, it's not just what's on my plate tonight, but it's what's at the grocery store. Who doesn't have access to a grocery store? How does the food get to the grocery store?
right.
How much does food cost? How much do people know how to cook or not know how to cook? All of the traditions, but then all of the farm policies and the political policies that have to do with food, and I mean it goes to history, and it goes to sociology, and it goes to nutrition, but in philosophy it goes to self, right? And it's not about understanding statistics, and it's not about understanding uh, nutrition. One of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is this notion that Michael Pollan came up with called nutritionism, which
Mm,
is basically the reduction of food into its chemical components rather than thinking about it as food. And
right.
so referring to things like protein and carbohydrates and sugars and the list, thinking about protein as chicken and beef and pork rather than chicken and beef and pork, which are radically different kinds of substances. Um, we call it protein and call it a day because that's some sort of chemical property that we have been pushed into thinking about food as. And if we reduce food into its chemical components like that, it becomes a science experiment, not pleasure, not I don't know. It's not community. It's not any of the things that food, I think, really should be. So I think that the age of nutritionism has really taken away a lot of the meaning of meals and eating together and family time, and then really sort of understanding why we eat, because it's
Yeah,
not a
absolutely.
science problem and it's not a math problem.
Yes, and obviously science and math will play into it, but at the end of the day, those are pretty small contributions to what's really happening.
Sure.
Just a couple things, and this is one, make sure that we recognize your work. Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. Very accessible, very passionate, and
Thank you.
it's kind of a weird compliment, but very earthy. Like I want to say sensual, but it's like of the senses, right? Like it's
Yeah. Well, it
very
is.
like
Yeah.
what you were describing with the food lab in your kind of teaching method. It definitely comes through in the book, and so I really enjoyed it. Uh, my wife would definitely feel some pain when you were talking about, instead of reading new mom books, you
Yeah.
started reading philosophy of food. So
Yeah.
when we talk about homeschooling for my boys, I'm referencing Jean-Baptiste Vico,
Mhm.
and my wife is just being very patiently listening. She's like, if
Yeah.
you want to homeschool them, that's fine. Like, why are we, you
Right.
know? So I felt that. And then it's really interesting that you mention how much work goes into cooking. and
Mm-hmm.
something I had a previous episode on the history of Mexican American labor in
Mm.
southeastern
Yeah,
California in agriculture, and there's this really interesting in our current society connection between unpaid or low paid labor equaling unskilled labor,
sure.
and how false that is, right?
Yeah,
Like cooking, the more I get into it, the it's very complicated, and
not
the reason we
unskilled.
don't yes, it's not unskilled at all. And
Growing
so I think
food is
that's
also not unskilled.
that was the exact point that came out again and again. It's that there's just tons of work that goes in. I have a small garden in the back, and my I've just started it, and my ignorance is overwhelming. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, but the kind of to bring it back around to what you ended with, I think when you talk about taking food out of its context, a great example of this and making it into these boxes of nutrition.
Right.
Um, a lot of my own thinking on food has been informed by the blue zone
Hmm. Yeah.
way of thinking about food, you know, the different like 90 plus year lifespan type thing. And one of the things that I was excited about, and my wife, you know, chided me for, is that most of the places where people live 90 plus in what they eat, they actually drink a lot.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and if you think of it totally in terms of nutrition, then you actually lose why that works. Because the
Right.
reason it works for them, for the most part, is they drink together and
Right.
it lowers stress. It allows them to be more open with each other. It's not
Hmm.
just that. And this is just like a very, I think, silly example, but a really good example of why you can't just take nutrition and just cram it. It's like, well, you can have these people drink this much alcohol a day, and it's like
Right.
it's not like they're drinking alone and then they're drinking it all at
Right.
once, right? They're drinking it like over the course of the day as they talk with each other, and
Right.
that's a great example of like obviously we know alcohol is not something that's naturally good for the body, at least in any, like, not in the amounts they're drinking, but it
Hmm.
is good for them socially, and the benefits seem to outweigh, for the most part, seem to outweigh the detriments.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that I mean, if we could lead that into the slow food movement, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot of what the slow food movement talks about is that it's not a math problem, it's not a scientific reduction, it's a way of life, and it sort of
Mm,
rejects the nutritionism, but it rejects all of the ways in which we are forced into what they call fast life, right?
right.
Is that we want slow food and slow life, and we want to explicitly reject fast food and fast life. And I think drinking together, eating together, having long meals together, not having cell phones while you're eating it's a huge part of it. One of the other things that I do that I talk about in the book some is that I've started taking students on a study away trip in the month of May, not recently, obviously, but we go to Italy.
Understandable.
Yeah, right. We go to Italy for what's called slow food Italian style, and we learn about the tenets of the slow food movement. Um, but we spend a week in Rome and learn about the history of slow food in Rome and Roman food and why all of the different parts of Italy have such drastically different food. Um, but then we go spend 2 weeks on a farm, an Italian farm in the mountains that makes olive oil and wine. And I think honestly, the most important part of the trip is that there's actually no cell phone service and no internet in this
Yep.
area. And so the college students have to just sort of abandon their phones. All of a sudden, their phones are absolutely useless. We're at a farm on the top of a mountain. We have a giant long table that we sit at every night. They help to cook. They help to gather. They set the table, and then we sit there for 3 hours laughing and telling stories and connecting in a way that many of them have told me later they've never connected before. And
Mm,
so I think food and being that part of community is just something that is really important, and it's not something that I want to let go of easily. And I think that the culture that we live in is pushes for us to eat when we feel hungry, maybe graze all day, not have family dinner together, um, or to be on our phones when we are with other people. It's I mean, that's one of the things that I've absolutely pushed with my boys and with my family is family dinner happens every night. It's just not a question. There's no activities that are scheduled in the evening. It's just we're going to have dinner together. That's just what we do. And I think that I can already see the impact of it just because I know that my boys are going to talk about stuff that they might not talk about otherwise. And they have that feeling of home.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's, you mentioned this earlier, and we had talked about this before we began, that for me, I had gone through a period of depression that seems to have been very strongly linked to my diet. But
Hmm.
I think you bring up a great point here is that no matter how well I eat, I do notice it's a multivariate thing, right? There's
Sure.
multiple things going on where if I sit down with my family and we have family dinner, which is something we try to do and sometimes fail, but it's something that
Yeah.
we try to do, that also leads to well-being. That also gives
Yeah.
for very important very important for mental health. And so, as we talk about this, I think that all kind of one of the main things that comes out of your book, and I think it's the most important, is this way that we have very thin goals as a culture. If I can put it that
Hmm.
way, we have very reductionist goals. And
Yeah.
so when we talk about one of the values of our culture is efficiency. And so
Yes.
things like phones at meals, why? Well, I'm going to do two things at once because then I'll get more done.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and we don't realize what we're losing because our idea of the good life is very, very thin. It doesn't have
Right.
this full broad range of personhood.
Right.
Um, so, yeah, and I did want to ask you this, as you were going through that chapter, you said you wanted to rein back in the idea that there were moral implications for slow food, but it
Mm.
does seem like there are some moral implications, even as you're talking about this. Do you feel comfortable discussing any possible moral implications, or maybe places where we could do further work on what moral implications for slow food could be?
Yeah. Can I go ahead and can I read the manifesto?
Absolutely.
This
Yeah.
is this is so I've got the book here and I just wanted to it's a it's a full page, but I wanted to read it just because I feel like it's really important. So
Yes.
so the slow food movement came about in 1986 when McDonald's opened the first store in Rome, and it was the first one in Italy. And the Italians were not going to have any of this. They thought this, America can have this, that Italy is not about fast food and it's not about any of the ideology that goes along with fast food. And so they protested with a pasta dinner, right? They set up
Right.
big long tables in front of this McDonald's in front of the Spanish Steps in Rome, and said, this is not happening here." And
I can't think of anything more Italian.
I know yeah, I picture it perfectly. So eventually, after a few years, there were people who came on the name, and they came on and they said, "Look, this is slow food. This is specifically not fast food." And so this is what they claim in their sort of their defense of to the right of pleasure in food. They say our century, which began and has developed under the insignia of industrial civilization, first invented the machine and then took it as its life model, the machine, that is. We are
Mm,
enslaved by speed and have all succumbed to the same insidious virus, fast life, which disrupt our habits, pervades the privacy of our homes, and forces us to eat fast foods. To be worthy of the name, Homo sapiens should rid themselves of speed before it reduces them to a species in danger of extinction. A firm defense of quiet material pleasure is the only way to oppose the universal folly of the fast life. May suitable doses of guaranteed sensual pleasure and slow, long-lasting enjoyment preserve us from the contagion of the multitude who mistake frenzy for efficiency. Our defense should begin at the table with slow food. Let us rediscover the flavors and savors of regional cooking and banish the degrading effects of fast food. In the name of productivity, fast life has changed our way of being and threatens our environment and our landscapes. So slow food is now the only truly progressive answer. That is what real culture is all about. Developing taste rather than demeaning it. And what better way to set about this than an international exchange of experiences, knowledge, and projects? Slow food guarantees a better future. Slow food is an idea that needs plenty of qualified supporters who can help turn this slow motion into an international movement with a little tiny snail as its symbol. So, yeah.
Sorry, I just laughed
Yeah.
at the snail part. I remember being like, "Oh, well, I mean, I could see why you choose that," but
Yeah, no,
it was a
it's
surprise.
awesome. It's perfect. Well, so you asked about moral implications, right? And I think that
Right.
slow food. So I want to start with I am an esthetician. I'm not an ethicist. And so what I think about is the taste, right, and the
Right.
community. And I guess I'm afraid. I don't know. I'm reluctant. We'll just say reluctant, not afraid.
Sure. Sure.
To talk about moral obligations. I don't want to say that, but I think that eating slow food is morally better, right? Because you're thinking about the people who brought you the food. You're thinking about how the food is made, and then you're spending quality time with the food when you're eating it, right? And so there's a lot of morality that comes in that, and at the same time, not everybody can do this, right? Not everybody can eat slow, in the slow food way, because there are lots and lots of people that just don't have access. But slow food is not, high end farm to table, farm to fork, organic downtown restaurant, right? Slow food, especially in Italy, right? I mean, pizza and pasta are flour and water with whatever comes out of the garden or whatever's left in the fridge put on top of it. I mean, that's really the origination of both of those meals. But it has to do with the history of cooking. It has to do with the history of women. It has to do with what's in the garden today. And you said you had a small garden. I suspect already you go, wow, if I had to feed myself, I'd be screwed.
Yes.
Right?
No, it's
I'd
a
just be
lot.
really
Yeah, I was
hungry.
like, yes.
Yeah.
That's become immediately apparent. Yeah.
Yeah, because we don't have this kind of knowledge, right? We don't have we can't even have like basic gardens in our backyard. And so there's a respect for the knowledge that goes into the history of cooking and the history of growing food. That I think that we don't respect it. When I think that it's hard for me to think really broadly because I deal with college students and I talk to them primarily, right? So I got 18 to 22-year-olds who are very busy, right? They have lots and lots of important things to do. They're overscheduled. And then they go to the dining hall and they eat, and then somebody else prepares it. They go in, they get what they want, and then somebody else does their dishes, and they go on their way. So they're not prompted to think about it at all, at least while they're here. And depending on what kinds of families they came from, They may or may not have been involved in food prep or whatever. But everybody eats, everybody has favorite foods, everybody has likes and dislikes. But I think there's I'll say, moral imperative to know how to cook. I think you should know how to do basic things for yourself. So I think there's also a moral imperative to do your own laundry, because I think it's part of taking care of yourself. And I think, I don't know what's going on with this generation, but there's a whole bunch of people that are having trouble with adulting, right? Because we now actually have adulting classes.
I've
But
not seen those. That's
oh, real? Yeah, no, there's adulting
God.
classes. You look online, but it's about laundry, and it's about finances, and it's about waking up with an alarm, and it's about what to eat. And it's about cooking, right? It's about how to actually just do basic things in the kitchen. And just that in and of itself is so disturbing to me, because I don't know what's happening in American households that would produce young adults who can't show up to a job, or can't, they don't know how the grocery store works, or they don't know how to, balance a checkbook, whatever the sort of modern day equivalent of that is online. I presume none of them have checkbooks, but balance a budget maybe.
Yeah.
But I think, eating is such a fundamental part of who we are, and just dismissing all of the stuff that goes into it because low paid workers can do it for me, right, is something that we're really missing out on as human beings.
And I feel like we're contributing to something that we are actually not valuing people the way they should be valued. We're taking their skill for granted and we're contributing to systems that continue to take them for granted
Right.
when we participate in those systems. And you obviously can't just withdraw from the world. I mean, you can do the hermit thing, but I wouldn't make that a moral imperative.
Right.
So it's not that you should never do these things, but being able to, I mean, at the very least, being able to be a responsible adult. If your philosophy can't allow for someone to be able to take care of themselves if they're an able-bodied person,
Right.
an able-minded person seems to be a mistake. It's something. And even removing it from moral imperatives, the idea of moral consequences seems to come out a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I love even about the way you frame it and the way that comes out and the way slow food obviously is very polemical, to fast life as they call it.
Yeah.
But there is kind of this very positive view of it, right? This way that like if you sit down and eat with your family, good things happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it creates this, and the problem is, and the reason this is so hard is our culture is against it in America. And besides that, it takes time to see the benefits.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Right? It takes, like, you have to do stuff like this for months before you really start to see the fruit of it. And
Sure.
It's very frustrating. And you have to make clear decisions to do these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
So
and I think that, because not every dinner is great, right? Not every conversation at dinner is great, right? Not every night are you going to get your kids to eat what you just spent time fixing, right? But at the same time,
as the father of a 4 and 7-year-old, that really hurt. I'm just going to tell you.
I mean, you get me, right? Yeah, I mean, but it's not going to be that way. But, at the same time, I think for me, it's a value, right? And it's a value that I say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to set up my household so that this is a value, and everybody knows, even implicitly, that this is just what we're going to do. I mean, there are people who say going to church is a value. And so we're going to set up our household so that we do this thing together as a family, even when the kids are crying, even when there's a diaper blowout, even, whatever, right? Even when it's awful, right? Even when there's a guest minister, it's like, this is a value and it's worth doing over and over and over because I've just decided that it's important to me.
Yes,
And
and that go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
no, as I was going to say, as a family unit, you make decisions like this about all kinds of things, right? And eating together can be one.
Yes, and if you don't have any of these values, right? If it's just you're constantly separated and constantly on screens, we have seen the studies on that, right? So
Sure.
whether it's going to church, going to a mosque or a synagogue, like you look at these sorts of things, choosing to do family vacation,
Right.
just being willing to look at your culture and to see what values are being pushed on you
Mm-hmm.
and what of those values you accept and which you reject. And I mean that goes back to just the examined life in general,
Right.
which is kind of for me an interesting lead into. I did want to hear your thoughts. I loved your chapter on good taste and bad taste,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the value of taste as a sense.
Yeah.
And obviously it's the cultural production of taste, which is a different sense of taste.
Right.
And then and also the prejudice against taste. I found that account interesting, throughout the history of philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. So there's food, right? The sort of the stuff that we ingest, and taste, which is us and the way that we respond to things individually that we put in our mouths.
Yes.
And there's preferences for certain things and aversions to certain things. But I really do believe that there is a cultivation of taste, of what I would call tongue taste, not cultural taste, and that it is an epistemological thing that we can develop, right? That we can get better at making fine discriminations about very certain things. I mean, and fine discriminations is a word or a phrase that David Hume used in the Standard of Taste. But I think that it very much applies here, where we can not just eat our favorite ice cream over and over, but learn about things that do have very subtle differences in them. Wine is the most often cited sort of, and it's probably the most complex thing that we taste regularly. And so people become experts and people get flights and they taste differences and they do wine tastings and they learn to compare and they learn what they like. But the level of expertise that high level sommeliers are able to achieve, the differences that they can discriminate is just astounding. But there are, I think I mentioned this in the book, but there are sommeliers that for water, for cheese, for olive oil, for all kinds of things. And so even if you're not a wine connoisseur or don't have access to lots of fancy different wines, which most people don't, you can learn to discriminate in every day. I mean, I was just up in North Carolina in the mountains with my kids, and my son asked me, he said, Mom, does the water taste funny here, or can I drink it straight? Because a lot of times I don't like the water that's not, it's not in Greenville, and I'm like, yeah, he knows already that water tastes different in different place. And
Yes.
he can start to figure out what is it about where we are now that is in the water that makes it taste different than at home, right?
Yeah, Florida water is not very good. I'm just going to be honest.
Yeah, Greenville, South Carolina water is the best. And I've actually I've seen accountings of the best tasting water in the country, and we really are
Yeah.
like top 10.
Oh wow!
Yeah, no, it's good.
Shout
But
out to Greenville. Yes.
yeah. One of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is olive oil, actually. And
Right.
partly because I did a lot of this research in Italy. That's their shining gold. But and anyone in Italy, no matter where they are, will tell you that they have the best olive oil. And everybody else will say that they have the best olive oil, but really they have the best olive oil.
Yeah,
And
of course, yes.
whether you're in east, south, north, or west, that's what they'll tell you, and they will be absolutely confident that it's true. Um, and they vary because the region varies, or the terroir varies, right? The whole climate and the whole geography of where the olives are grown is different, and so the olive oil will be different. Um, and so I love that it's just such a source of pride for the Italians, but it's also something that we as Americans, we go, well, how do I get good olive oil? I'll just pay a lot. Well, no, I mean, you actually have to be able to taste the difference in order for it to mean anything. Right. And it's just like wine. You don't just buy the most expensive bottle of wine. If you can't tell the difference that it's better, then there's no point in buying something that's expensive. If you can taste olive oil and go, oh my gosh, that's really good, or peppery, which is really the prime thing that you're looking for in a good olive oil, then you should buy it. The other thing that's really important about olive oil is that it's fresh, right? And so, unlike all other vegetable oils, olive oil is made from the flesh of the fruit and not the seed or the pit. And so it's actually it's actually fruit juice. And so, just like I probably wouldn't want to drink orange juice that's 3 years old. I don't want to have olive oil that's 3 years old either. I want to know that it's fresh. It doesn't matter where in the world it comes from. I just don't want it to be old and rancid. And since
Well, that would, yes.
yeah, I mean, most olive oil in American kitchens is old and rancid. But given that we don't taste it, or we don't know how to taste, we don't know, and then it doesn't matter, right? But there's all these health benefits that come with good fresh olive oil that don't come with old olive oil, or olive oil that has been diluted with other kinds of oil, or oil that has been combined with oils from all over the world. Olive oil is the most adulterated substance on earth, and only about 2% of the olive oil that is sold is actually 100% fresh extra virgin olive oil.
Yeah, I remember reading that and just thinking, ew. So
Right.
that's
Right, exactly.
that's not a good day. Yeah, absolutely. I did want to ask you, and you mentioned Hume, and then there's this really interesting, and it's a very complex discussion, so I don't expect like a full explanation of this on the spot. But Kant talks about how we process perception.
Mm,
And so when you talk about wine and how it's the most complex tasting, a lot of that comes back to the culture that's been built around it in training our taste to distinguish the wine,
mhm,
right? It's not that wine itself. I mean, uh, it's obviously more complex than many other things, but there are things that are as complex as wine in terms of tasting that you could figure out. Something like olive oil would probably be pretty close.
mhm,
But what really distinguishes wine is the culture that's been built around it to refine that judgment.
mhm, mhm.
Do you have any thoughts in that regard?
I mean, in terms of Kant?
Well, more in terms of that, like how that culture interacts with that development of judgment. Yeah,
Yeah.
I won't make it. I won't make you give a. I won't ask for a reading of Kant off the cuff. I think
Yeah.
that's
No, I mean, no,
inconsiderate.
I just taught all this stuff, so it's not that far gone. Kant actually, I'll give you a little thought on Kant, and then another
Sure.
thought on the culture built up around it. Kant actually says specifically in the Analytic of the Beautiful that things that we eat and drink are not available to be beautiful. And that's what, I mean, that's what he's thinking. He's talking about the sublime and the beautiful.
Right.
But he says they can't be beautiful because we don't have any objectivity. We don't have any distance to reflect on it, right? So basically, he says we can't think about things that we eat or drink because they're in our mouths. And so we can only things that things that are beautiful or sublime have to be things that we look at with our eyes and our ears, basically. And so it's part of one of the history of sort of why taste is not respected all that well, is because Hume and Kant say, you know, we can't give the highest appreciation of taste to things that we ingest. But so he would reject this particular discussion out of hand anyway. But
Right.
the larger culture around wine, we'll say we'll leave it to wine. It influences the way that we think about it greatly, right? And there's a lot of there's the sort of stay-at-home mom wine culture, right? Well, and there's I'm working really hard, so I need to go drink culture. And there's I mean, there's there's a
Right.
lot of that. And then there's a lot less sort of sober culture that says, I don't need this out of desperation, right? I'm going to drink it when I can enjoy it. But I think that there's a lot of pressure now in that. I don't know how much culture is pushing us to really develop tastes about what we like. Right. And I think that, White Zinfandel, which is a manufactured blended wine that came out of Sutter Home, I think. It's what I might call a starter wine, right? It's easy, it's not complex, and it's something that a lot of women especially will start with and say, okay, that's my thing, and maybe not get more complex. It's usually relatively inexpensive, and so you drink it when you're just drinking to drink. And it's not it's not particularly masculine. It's not going to be something that a bunch of men sitting around in the backyard are going to be out drinking a bunch of white zin, right?
There's
But
part of me now that wants to make that, like, I don't have an Instagram account, but I want to make that Instagram post just
yeah,
a bunch of guys.
yeah, I mean, right? I mean, it's just not a thing.
Right, it's true.
But there's so there's that sort of culture, right? But the culture around wine, I think, has a lot to do with class.
Yeah, you've
Which
mentioned that quite a
just
bit.
says, right, so I can drink the grocery store wine with my lady friends, or I can order a nice glass at dinner, which is going to be a little more. You're talking about 8, 10, $20, for a nice glass of wine. Or I order a bottle at dinner, which is even more. And then above that, I'm interested in tasting, right? I'm going to go to the Biltmore estate and do a wine tasting. And I think it's 100% class, right? It's 100%. I have access to these slight variations of flavor that maybe I can detect, right? And maybe I'll go buy a bottle if I'm at the Biltmore house, or wherever. That's what's close here.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned all this, and I think one of the things you talk about locale quite a bit, and class becomes a bigger issue the further you are from the locale.
Sure.
Right? Because like wine in Central Florida becomes much more of a class thing because it's the vineyards in Florida are not like like that's someone who's like reaching out and has access to wine from California, wine from
Right.
Italy or France, versus like if you live in France and you live in the countryside, even if you're going to have access to probably a better quality of wine just by
Sure.
virtue of where you live.
Yeah. And what they would call table wine, right? Just sort of the stuff we have laying around is better than most everything that we have here, just because they make it there.
Right. Right. And so that's, yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think that discussion about, terroir, just butchered that, but, but,
Terroir.
terroir, uh, thank you. And locale is really fascinating. And the way that, like as we become more globalized, it just creates further inequities and clear disparities between classes and what they have access to.
Sure.
Right. And that's what you're referencing in terms of like, I think you mentioned how aristocrats, as wine kind of came out, had more access to, this is in your discussion of bad taste, I believe. They
Mm-hmm.
had more access because they had more time. They had more free time and more time to, kind of fritter away. And so that became kind of this idea of bad taste, that they were like, they weren't constrained by any kind of good goal with it. They would just just kind of experiment and just rely solely on the pleasure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And
Uh,
that's, something you can do when you've got money.
yeah, that discussion seemed to me especially interesting. And you mentioned, and I'd love you just to talk about this, that we don't need. You talked about philosophy often focuses on how to constrain pleasure, and you said, and I don't want to misquote you here. I should have brought it up, but I don't want to go digging for it. How you don't think that that's really a great way to go about it, is to focus on constraining pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that conclusion for you?
Yeah, I think that philosophy has a history of demeaning the body, right? Specifically, right? Philosophy is all about what can we think about? What are our moral obligations? How do we produce consciousness? Um, and I think bodily experience uh, it's associated with women for one. It's associated with basically inebriation and sex, right? So those are the two things that philosophers think that the body really does, right? So you feed it in order to just keep consciousness going, but the real risk of losing control, losing rationality, is with inebriation and sexual pleasure. And so I think that those are the things that I have found in the history of philosophy, where they just go, body is bad, the body is bad, the body is bad, it's dangerous, it's subversive, and then one of the things that I don't find in the history of philosophy is any sort of discussion of the embodied experience of being pregnant and giving birth, right? So, I mean, that's not something that philosophers have historically talked about, but obviously it's something that we've done for centuries. And if we haven't, then we wouldn't have been here. But
Right.
I mean, that in and of itself is an incredible phenomenological experience, right? To grow another person in your body, right? It's amazing. And then to get that little person out, and then to watch that little person grow, right? And they grow proportionately. And because you have small ones, right? You put them down for bed one day, and the next night the next day they're actually just bigger, right? How does
Yeah.
that happen? But they don't grow, improportionately. They grow and they get bigger and bigger overnight. And right, that this experience is never talked about in terms of bodily pleasure, right? Breastfeeding certainly isn't talked about in terms of bodily pleasure. It's not like
Just
you're
trying to
gonna,
imagine that in Aristotle.
yeah, right. I mean, it doesn't come up, but I mean, that's a thing, right? It
Yeah.
feels good
Yeah.
to let that thing that has been stored up release. But what philosophers do talk about is how getting drunk is going to destroy our capacity for reason, And I don't know, sexual orgies, which is somehow this other thing that they talk about quite a lot, is going to make us lose our sort of physical boundaries. And I just think I think it's crazy, but then the other thing is just sort of what happens when we overindulge in food, right? And so for philosophers, it often becomes it's a moral problem that you get fat, right? Or that you're overweight, or that what you're eating is causing you to not be rational, right? Or even causing you to be depressed. I think we have uh, an epidemic of obesity in our country that could be helped, I'll say, with some radical changes in diet. And most people would say, I would rather continue eating the way I eat and die earlier. Right. And, philosophically, it's crazy, right? Because philosophically, what we really want to do is to just be able to think clearly and experience things and try to make sense of them. Right. But to say, to just really deny the body's role in all of that. But practically, if we ate a more plant-based diet, well, I would say even literally one day a week, it would help the environment, it would help the farmers, it would help it would help the ground, it would help transportation costs, it would help us immensely, but we're not willing to do it. We won't do it.
And there's a cultural built up taste around that about why that's not okay. That's actually, I think, has some moral implications that I think are unhealthy. But that's I understand it becomes very complicated because you think about access and things like that, and I understand that.
Yeah.
I have to reference this because I remember reading the perfect example which you're talking about in regards to that focus on being rational and all this. I remember reading when I was around like 16, I was just getting into philosophy, and I was reading like a history of philosophy, and it was talking about Aristotle's prime mover, and that what the most perfect being in the world is the one who just sits there and thinks. And I was like, even at 16, I was like, that's awfully convenient for Aristotle to say that that's the greatest being of all time. It's like, you really like to think, and man, who's really perfect is the guy who just thinks all the time. I was like, that seems a little self-gratifying.
Yeah, thinking about thinking. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's, he's part of the groundwork of philosophical thinking, is that we are disembodied minds with bodies that, we just kind of have to drag along with us. But I just think that that's really short-sighted. And I don't understand why more philosophers haven't said, hey, this is really dumb. Right. It's like, actually, we're in bodies, not incidentally, but always and necessarily.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what we eat, the quality of what we eat, how much we eat, who with we eat, it all has an impact on how well we think. Right. And there's all this discussion about we have to feed school children so that they can do basic things in school. And if they're hungry, they're not going to learn anything. Right. But when do we have those discussions about adults? Right.
Yeah. And we probably should have more discussions about. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, but you graduate to philosophy and then they say, oh, the body doesn't matter at all.
Right. Like, what just happened? Also, I can't help but, I have to ask, is the next book a phenomenology of pregnancy? Because that would be cool.
No. there are actually a few articles I read about it, but I don't honestly think that I have I don't have any really profound thoughts about pregnancy other than damn, that was cool. Like that was way better than I thought it would be. I loved
That's
being pregnant
yeah.
and I loved having
Hmm.
little kids. And it really was just, it was amazing to me to just watch that happen. But no, the next book is called Drinking and Thinking. Actually, it's about things that we drink, including tea, coffee, wine, spirits, beer, and how culturally all of those things are really, really different and how they do different things to us cognitively.
Oh, that's fascinating as well. Um, I have to ask: is it drinking and thinking with the
Yes,
apostrophes, or is it drink?
yes,
Oh, yes, as it should be, as it should be.
yes. I mean, I
Um,
am in South Carolina.
yes, yeah. You have to respect your terroir. I think I still
Yes,
butchered it,
yes, drinking and
but
thinking.
yes, yes. Um, that's awesome. Kind of as we wrap up here, I was wondering, uh, what would you like to leave our listeners with? If you could leave them with one thing, what would you leave our listeners with?
Hmm. Wow, that's the biggest question. I mean,
Right. Let me make a very reductionist, efficient. Ask for something very reductionist and efficient here at the end. Yeah, just
yeah,
to contradict everything we've been saying.
you should you should travel. Maybe
Hmm.
that's it. Is traveling and finding food in another culture or in another community is an incredible way to go out beyond yourself, right? And so
Hmm.
even if you go to the next state, you don't have to go to another continent, but you just go to another community. Eating and sharing their food with them is an incredible way to enter into their culture, and to continue to go to fast food because it's familiar and because it's easy and because we know it is an outward rejection of all these sort of small communities or households or cultural knowledge that we have. And even in the South, I mean, we have an incredible history of we have this incredible culinary history that was, of course, embroiled in slavery, but the foods and the knowledge and the skills that the slaves brought over and gifted us against their will in the South is absolutely incredible. Um, but to be able to go to a culture and to share their food it's a way of respecting, but it's also a way of coming to know other people and other lands. That was pretty
Absolutely. Yeah.
profound, right?
Oh no, I loved it. Yeah, that was. I've been blessed to travel, and to kind of go along what you're saying. Uh, the way I learned to now, we do have access that I think, while still slightly class based, is not as much. The internet is becoming more and more ubiquitous.
Yeah,
I learned all my cooking from YouTube,
yeah.
and something that you even mentioned is, uh, there are communities online where you can learn to cook, I'll say authentically, but like
Anything.
I was looking in the grocery store for things or ordering things from Amazon that I had no idea what they were, and it just taking the time to do that was huge. And I think you're exactly right. It's a great way to embody yourself in another culture in
Yeah.
a meaningful way. So yeah,
Well, and I
thank you for
think
sharing.
there's also sort of embody yourself in your own culture, right? Ask your grandma for a recipe, right? If you can, ask your grandma to teach you how to cook something, with her, if you can.
Yeah.
But those are cultural knowledge that we have that we often overlook in our own families, right? And I think just cooking together and being together can be life changing, really can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Worth, just want to say thank you so much. We'll of course put a link to your book down in the description, but it's just been a real joy. So thank you for
Yeah,
joining us
thank
today.
you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.